Okay, the first essay in this section is the problem of method. Um, I'm titling it the problem of method. The problem of method, which is the title of the section, exists as a subcategory of one, the significance of the humanist tradition for the human sciences, which is a subcategory of one, transcending the aesthetic dimension, which is a subcategory of part one, the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art, which is a subcategory of the title of the book, which is Truth and Method. It is too bad that Gadamer did not find an easier way to communicate the complexity of his first section. I have no doubt that this subcategory way of writing has been implicated in turning a great many away from this piece of writing. Such a style reminds me of the text known as Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Then again, given the problematic situation of the seeming need of the Critique of Pure Reason within the major limitations of tradition, perhaps it is a good thing that Truth and Method takes on this complex style of Kant's first critique. There likely couldn't be a more abject group of dogmatic academic tyrants as those who seem to have a lifelong lasting affinity towards Kant's first critique. Perhaps Gadamer's seemingly Kantian style will be inviting for those seemingly entangled in the delusions of Kant's first critique. Nevertheless, moving forward, how does the meaning of the sentences contained in the section the problem of method answer the questions: what is the problem with method? It's significant for the humanist tradition, for the human sciences, its relationship to transcending the aesthetic dimension, its relationship to the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art, as well as its relationship to truth and method in general. Although it also seems right to answer the questions what is or what seems to be the question of truth that is as it emerges in the experience of art, its relationship to transcending the aesthetic dimension. What is the aesthetic dimension, and perhaps its significance for the humanist tradition in its relationship to the human sciences, as well as what is the humanist tradition and the human sciences this text seems to be talking about, because the problem of method is the beginning point for explaining these relationships. I will start only exploring how the meaning of the sentences in the section the problem of method seem to explain the problem of method for only the section the problem of method. So, what is the problem of method? According to this text, the problem with method seems to be that the logical self-reflection that accompanied the development of the human sciences in the 19th century is wholly governed by the model of the natural sciences. This is a problem for several reasons. First, due to the historical foundation of the human sciences, the specific problem that the human sciences present to thought is that one has not rightly grasped their nature if one measures them by the yardstick of progressive knowledge of regularity. And why is this a problem? Third, because when one measures the data of the human sciences by the yardstick of a progressive knowledge of regularity, the tendency is that people are tempted to describe the human sciences in a merely negative way as an inexact science. Moreover, as the text continues to develop, it demonstrates that there have been a few historical people who have noticed significant differences between the human sciences and the natural sciences. Hermann Helmholtz distinguished between two kinds of induction: logical and artistic induction. The translators interpretation of Gadamer's distinction seems to hold that this implied that Helmholtz saw that the method of the human sciences was not logical, but rather psychological, and this also implied that the method of the human sciences was unconscious rather than conscious, and hence that the basis of the method of the human sciences lie in its tact and other intellectual capacities as well, e.g., a well-stocked memory and acceptance of authority. I think you could say rather than the procedure of it's kind of an interesting thought, because if the basis, well, I'll explain. Another historical figure that noticed significant differences between the human and natural sciences was J.G. Droysen. Unlike Helmholtz, Droysen, who happened to be a historian by trade, seems to be one of the first people to clearly see that the historical dimension of the human sciences was what distinguished the human from the natural sciences. Droysen is quoted to have said that the more profoundly grasped idea of history will be the center of gravity in which the chaotic movement of the human sciences will gain stability and the possibility of further progress. It is even claimed that Droysen's historic attempted to establish the human sciences as an equally autonomous, self-reliant group of sciences. Another historical figure to observe some of the methodological differences between the human and natural sciences was Wilhelm Dilthey. Like Droysen, Dilthey saw that the historical dimension of the human sciences was a significant part of what distinguished them from the natural sciences. Nevertheless, Gadamer's seeming point is thus that the development of Helmholtz, Droysen, and Dilthey are in need of greater development. Moreover, even though the method of the natural sciences governing the human sciences seems to causes one to give the human sciences a negative description, possessed of the intellectual heritage of German classicism, they have nevertheless carried forward the proud awareness that they were the true representatives of humanism. Thus, in other words, what is the problem with methods in relationship to the significance of the humanist tradition for the human sciences, in relationship to the transcending the aesthetic dimension, in relationship to the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art, in relationship to truth and method? In relation to the entire work, the section of the problem of method doesn't say much about truth, and perhaps only a little bit about the aesthetic dimension of the situation. The significance of the humanist tradition for the humanist science and the problem of method, however, are parts of this section that are addressed. And as such, according to the text, the problem of method for the human sciences seems to be that because the human sciences have developed in the shadow of the natural science, governed by their valued method of inducting conclusions, is that this development is related to a very pervasive misunderstanding of the human sciences. With this misunderstanding, people often see that the data of the human or moral sciences and their outcomes being interrogated through the scientific method only as negative. Also, this section seems to say that there is a strong relationship between history and the method of the human sciences as artistic. Somehow, this is related to tact, education, memory, in ways that seems to be responsible for one overlooking these things. It seems, to put it another way, that when one measures the data of the human or moral sciences, i.e., psychology, education, history, literary studies, anthropology, archaeology, and the political sciences, only by the scientific method, e.g. the progressive knowledge of regularity that makes it possible to predict individual phenomena and processes, such people will overlook the more accurate being of the human sciences, which is related more to the history and hence tact and an aesthetic dimension of human knowledge. Or put another way, one's conception of truth is profoundly limited if they only accept truth on the basis of one's use of reason or the scientific method, and somehow these reason and scientific method are related, yet in ways I do not understand as of yet. Moreover, if one does this, they are generally misunderstanding what truth is. Yet, before I move on from this section, I want to respond to a little of what I understand in it. One frustrating point about this section is that it seems to value a method of historical research that doesn't reflect how tradition uses it. For instance, the translator's interpretation of Gadamer's understanding of the method of historical research is as follows. Historical research does not endeavor to grasp a concrete phenomenon as an instance of a universal rule. The individual case does not serve only to confirm a law from which practical predictions can be made. Its ideal, rather, is to understand the phenomena itself in its unique and historical concreteness. However much experimental universals are involved, the aim is not to confirm and extend the universalized experiences in order to attain knowledge of law, e.g. how men and peoples and states evolve, but to understand how this man, this people, or this state is what it has become, or more generally, how it happens to be so. Conversely, I cannot think of a more characteristic aspect of tradition than to do exactly the opposite. In other words, to use an understanding of history as if it is not endlessly contingent, and then offer such an understanding as a universally true law, very similar to how the natural sciences go about their work. And I'm going to pause right there and say, I don't give very many examples of this, but I really do feel like this is a characteristic part of tradition, to do exactly the opposite. And the one example I can come off, just off the top of my head, is more found within like religious contexts, where people use the Bible to their understanding as the Bible as a law, as like a universal law that we need to upon which we should judge universally everything. And though that's what I see happening. And I think, for instance, the Mormon text, the Book of Mormon, is a good example of this. Throughout the book, it comes up with it will like present a possible historical narrative, derived from this narrative a law that you got to obey God's commandments or else you won't prosper in the land. And this becomes like a universally binding rule for which everyone should follow. And that's totally to use an understanding of history as if it is not endlessly contingent, and then offer such an understanding as a universally binding true law, very similar to how it goes about in the natural sciences. And in fact, when one of the problems of tradition is when they do this, they actually do it misunderstanding the scientific method. Scientific method should be way more uncertain, because it should be a place of immense questioning. The conclusions shouldn't remain dogmatic and concrete. They should open up to different questions, but that's not what happens. And so when religion or traditional people, because I think it doesn't just happen in religion, though I don't have any conservatism, I see a lot of conservative people doing the same thing, but I'm not going to get into it too much. But when they do this, they're misunderstanding science, the method of science, and perhaps you could say they're misunderstanding history, but when they mix the two, what they get is just so screwed up, because they're taking something that shouldn't even be capable of being dogmatic in the way it's dogmatic to begin with, and they're giving it this ultra-dogmatic, binding, seeming reality that really is just, I think to call it delusion would be very accurate, because it's so delusional. It's so not accurate. And it's self-evident to these people. And so, anyways, moreover, another frustrating thing about this text, at least thus far, is that it only allows the ideal of history to be understanding how this man, this people, or this state is what it has become, or generally how it happens to be so. In light of tradition perhaps misunderstanding history, which I think they do, or use it abjectly, I am persuaded that historical research consciously valuing another method of history may also be a productive response to tradition. And this is another thing I don't go into, but I really think that if you become aware of how tradition is misunderstanding history, and then you do a bunch of historical work consciously valuing an alternative method of historical research, perhaps focusing on rupture or discontinuity rather than history as an endless amount of continuity where everything relates to each other. When you do that, I think, and you value those historical narratives based on research, and you kind of mimic what's happening, it kind of puts tradition. I think it should, and at least this is what's happened for me, but I think it could be this way for other people, is that it can open up the need for historical reflection in a way that is not currently happening, in a way that hopefully would productively release the dogmatism that it currently exists in. From another direction, though I believe that truth and method does extend the awareness of the problem of method within the human sciences to the natural sciences, it thus far seems only to be a subtle thing that happens throughout this text. A glimpse of this is perhaps seen in the problem of method when, after the idea of historical research is given, the translators interpret Gadamer to have said, "What kind of knowledge is it that understands that something is so because it understands that it has come about so?" What does science mean here? In context, one may be tempted to interpret this question as only being related to the human sciences. However, perhaps given that this text seems likely to be a response to the modern dogmatic Kantian influences, perhaps it is Gadamer's or the translator's intention to keep this informative way an awareness of how the human sciences are profoundly different from the natural sciences from being applied back to the natural sciences. In other words, though I agree that in some respect the natural sciences may be fundamentally different from the human sciences, I think I also see this text as trying to say that once one sees the distinction, they should also be able to see that by perfecting the method of the human sciences, we are also perfecting the method of the natural sciences, because all that helps one better understand the method of the human sciences is applicable to the natural sciences. And I gave one example of that there, but I think in this first section there's also a period of it talking about of meteorology as being an unpredictable science. And I think another way of putting this is that Gadamer is trying to blur the line between what is human science and what is science. And by focusing on the human sciences and the problems with the methodology there, I really strongly believe that he is consciously, and when I get to the latter part of this book, I'll try to make this argument a little bit clearer, because I can't remember all the places where he talks about it. But I think he's consciously trying to say that what we're doing in the natural sciences needs to evolve. And that's significant because I've heard a couple of responses to Truth and Method where they read Truth and Method and they're like, hey, what about the natural sciences? I mean, like it's almost like he's only focusing on the human sciences, but I don't think that's what he's doing. Although he is very much so focusing on the human sciences and the method, and if he's doing anything else, it's kind of like a subtle thing he's doing. Um, anyways, that's my first section. See ya.